talk about Rasputin, right? He was the mad monk, you know, you know, right, and you know, that was kind of a scandal, but it was embarrassing to the capitalists to have the leader of their country, you know, I mean, just enamored with Rasputin, who was this, you know, he was a con man, and he did some sleight of hand magic tricks or something, and you know, the royal family, you know, thought he was great, and they had him projected everywhere, and you know, anyone could see this man was just a charlatan, a tomfoolery. I mean, he was just, you know, and it was just really embarrassing, and it ended up that the nobles ended up assassinating the guy because they thought it would be for the good of the country. You know, it was that, you know, I mean, it was that embarrassing that thousands and thousands of dollars were being spent out of the state budget, you know, to accommodate this poor priest from Siberia who, you know, just could do some magic tricks and, you know, said he could talk to the dead, and, you know, he was just, I mean, he was a charlatan, and he made his career out of that, and it was a scandal all through Europe, you know, and the whole world was kind of laughing at the czars in Russia that they were, you know, falling for this nonsense.
And the Tsarina thought that Rasputin was keeping her son alive. He had
leukemia.
The bleeding disease.
You know, confrontation between the capitalists on the one hand and the monarchy. It came to a head when World War I entered. Okay, the Russians were on the side of the United States and Britain and France against the Germans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottomans in World War I. And it was really a fight over the colonial world. And as the war was raging, which is extremely unpopular among the peasants and the soldiers and all that, and the monarchy was losing the war. They were losing the war overwhelmingly, and it was embarrassing to the capitalists. Now you have to put that on pause and now go back to what's going on with the peasants and the working class. Now
I said, the ones who were doing the dying.
Right. Now I have to say, you know, while for a long time, as I'd said before, the peasants saw the revolutionaries as just being something that really had nothing to do with them. They, interestingly enough, a lot of the peasants, because of, you know, famines that were happening, were going to the cities to get jobs in factories. And when they were getting jobs in factories, they were joining Marxist-led unions. And then, of course, the punishment, if you were, you know, if there was a strike and it was broken, is they would expel you from the city. So all of these you know, workers who had gone on strike and had come up would return to their home village full of revolutionary ideas and full of, you know, Marxism, and you started seeing in these tiny villages these Marxist groups popping up, talking about socialism and the need to tear down the capitalist system and all of that. And you hadn't seen that for, you know, before. And for a while, they said that no more was the word revolutionary, Lenin talked about, synonymous with the phrase student. It was synonymous then with striker, with a worker who'd been on strike. That was what revolutionary became symbolic of. So in the lead up, in 1917, it became very apparent to the monarchy or to the capitalists that the Tsar was an impediment to them in fighting the war.
Well, in the meantime, hadn't the military swung over to them in some of these confrontations also?
Numerous times. The capitalists had control of the military, and so the capitalists wanted to get rid of the Tsar. And so it began in February, and actually it was January. It was January 8th, but then with like the Gregorian calendar, like you said. And it was actually the women who led it. It was garment workers, I believe, in St. Petersburg who went out on strike. And their demand was, you know, 8-hour day, and then they had banners down with the Tsar, 8-hour workday, you know, end the war, and they went out on strike. And because the capitalists wanted to use this opportunity to bring down the Tsar, they didn't send in the army to smash the strike like they normally did. They let the strike go on, and that led to strikes in other industries. And pretty soon, they did send some army factions out to suppress them, and then the army factions switched sides and went over to the Bolsheviks. Not the Bolsheviks, but the people, the revolutionary movement. And so strikes were spreading all throughout St. Petersburg, and the Tsar was forced to abdicate the throne, and he announced his abdication, and a provisional government was set up led by Alexander Kerensky.
Well, not to forget, too, that World War I going on, they had lost, what, nearly 400,000 men in the war?
Probably more than that. I mean, and the army was in a state of revolt, and so this provisional government was set up led by Kerensky. But in the process of the strike, a new network of Soviets had been formed, like the Soviets in St. Petersburg. A whole new network of Soviets had been formed, and it was like Lenin talked about what he called dual power, meaning that you had the government of the capitalists, which was a coalition of the it was called the Cadets, and it's short for Constitutional Democratic Party, and that was the main capitalist party. And then you had the Social Revolutionary Party, which was the kind of moderate, and you had the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks maybe had 1 or 2 representatives. At first they were small. That was the official on paper government. But you had another government that was already kind of operating on its own, which was the Soviets. You know, these workers' councils had authority in many areas, and they were doing things that the state, you know, oddly enough, used to do. They had their own police forces. They were playing the role of the state. And so Lenin talked about you had dual power. You had 2 governments in existence. So at this time, Lenin was actually in exile in Sweden for his revolutionary activities. He had been kicked out of the country, and he returned to into Russia. When he returned,
but before he returned, he wrote letters from afar to encourage them to, and because they didn't, the leaders at the time didn't have a clue as to the revolutionary potential of what was going on.
Well, yeah, I mean that's the leaders.
He was urging them.
Right, the leaders of the Bolshevik Party in Moscow were Stalin and Kamenev.
Yes.
And both of them kind of had this idea, like you said, they didn't understand it could be a revolutionary situation, and so they joined an alliance with the Bolsheviks and with the Social Revolutionaries, and they kind of had this idea of, you know, peace. And when Lenin returned, he came and he wrote this very famous document. It's known as the April Thesis, but it was also called The Tasks of the Proletariat in Our Revolution. And it was a list of things he was critiquing the leadership of the Bolshevik Party about. And he said, first of all, that now there's great revolutionary potential, the task of the proletariat in our revolution. We need to differentiate ourselves from the reformists and all of that. We need to make clear that we have a revolutionary program, and they don't. And he raised all of these, you know, demands. He said, first of all, the Mensheviks, the Social Revolutionaries, and the Cadets, they're all for continuing the war. However, we are opposed to the war. We oppose the war. What else? I mean, he said that you know, they wanted, you know, he raised all these demands: nationalization of banking, workers' control of industry, all kinds of, you know, very populist and not just populist but revolutionary demands that cut at the heart of capitalism. And he had a whole list of them. And he also said the Bolsheviks should change their name from the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, Bolshevik in parentheses, to the Communist Party. And they said the reason was that all of the socialist parties of the world, the social democratic parties, had all supported the war and had all entered an alliance with the capitalists. He said if we change our name to the Communist Party, that will differentiate ourselves from social democracy, which was the other Marxists of the world that were reformists and were not opposing the system. So when Lenin returned with his April Thesis, he won over a whole lot of the party, the majority of the party, to his positions. So the Soviets were in existence. They took positions in the provisional government. And it got to the point where, you know, all throughout, there were all these, like, it was weird because, you know, the final revolution.
Tell me a little more about the provisional government.
Now, the provisional government, they were capitalists. I mean, it was Alexander Kerensky, and they wanted to continue the war, and they were a provisional government. They were going to write a new constitution, and they were going to change Russia from being a monarchy to a capitalist democratic republic. And they were, you know, getting ready. They were going to have a constitutional convention.
And the Bolsheviks took a position in the provisional government.
Yes,
also.
they did take seats in the provisional government.
And who else?
Like I said, the Constitutional Democrats, the Cadets, the Social Revolutionaries, and the Mensheviks all had seats in the provisional government. And the provisional government was dominated by the capitalists. But like I said, it was a different layer because there was also the Soviets, you know, which were this other layer. And there kept being crises that would arise. And one of the big points the Bolsheviks raised is they were opposed to the war. The capitalists wanted to continue the war, and they continued. They were for the war, and the Bolsheviks were not. And the war now.
Peace and land.
Yes, that was eventually the slogan: was peace, land, bread, peace, and land, whatever order you want to put it in. And that was the, you know, the eventual slogan. And